Audie Murphy, the most decorated American soldier of World War II turned Hollywood legend, carried with him more than medals and movie scripts. Behind his heroic smile and boyish charm, there were secrets he had quietly guarded for decades. Murphy had seen the bright lights of fame and the dark corners that most would never believe existed. As the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds faded, he began to speak about what he had truly witnessed in the golden age of Hollywood. A world of illusions, fear, and forbidden truths. He wasn't pointing fingers or seeking attention. He was unburdening his soul. Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s was a place where image mattered more than truth, where actors lived double lives to survive the industry's rigid expectations. Murphy, a man who had faced gunfire on the battlefield, now faced a different kind of war, a moral one. He quietly revealed stories of loneliness, sacrifice, and the painful masks so many wore just to fit in. Before his tragic death in 1971, Murphy hinted that some of the biggest stars of his era were not who the public thought they were, not because of scandal, but because they were forced to hide their real selves. What he shared in those final conversations painted a haunting picture of an industry built on secrets, and the toll it took on the people within it. When Audie Murphy first arrived in Hollywood after the war, he was still haunted by the battlefield. He had seen more death and despair than any man his age should have, yet he found himself in another kind of conflict. One that wasn't fought with rifles, but with lies, masks, and silence. The studios wanted him to be the all-American hero, the symbol of courage and moral purity. He wore the uniform again, only this time it was made of celluloid and studio contracts. Murphy soon realized that beneath the glamour, Hollywood was a fragile dream built on fear. Everyone had something to lose. A misstep, a rumor, a misplaced word, and a career could vanish overnight. The stars smiled for the cameras, but behind closed doors, they whispered about the price of staying relevant. Image was everything. Authenticity could be dangerous. Murphy once confided to a close friend that the battlefield had been more honest than the film set. At least in war, he knew who the enemy was. He saw actors who longed for freedom, but lived in constant dread of being discovered, not for crimes, but for simply being different. Agents crafted stories, publicists arranged marriages, and studios demanded loyalty to the illusion. It was an era when personal truth was treated as a scandal, and silence was survival. Murphy, who had faced bullets, couldn't understand why people who only wanted to live honestly had to fight so hard to do so. He admired their courage quietly. He never named names, never betrayed confidences, but in the last years of his life, when the weight of his own trauma grew unbearable, Murphy began to reflect on what he had seen. He spoke of compassion, of understanding those who lived under the shadow of judgment. "War changes a man," he said in one rare interview, "but so does fear." To him, the fear that ruled Hollywood was every bit as destructive as the fear that haunted soldiers in the trenches. Murphy described evenings at smoky Beverly Hills parties where laughter masked sorrow. He'd watch fellow actors perform even when the cameras weren't rolling, pretending to be happy, pretending to fit in. He once said it broke his heart to see good men and women forced to live behind glass walls, beautiful and untouchable but always alone. The price of fame was isolation. As his own career began to wane, Murphy grew more reflective, almost philosophical. He started to see that bravery wasn't just about facing enemy fire. It was also about daring to live authentically in a world that punished truth. In his final months, he shared that belief with those closest to him, insisting that Hollywood's greatest untold stories weren't about money or awards. They were about people who dared to be themselves in secret. It was a revelation born not of gossip, but of empathy. Murphy had carried the burden of other people's silence, just as he carried his own wartime ghosts. He never judged, only observed. And perhaps that is why, decades later, his words still echo. They weren't accusations. They were a plea for kindness in a time when kindness was rare. Audie Murphy died young, but the truths he hinted at outlived him. He had peeled back the curtain on a world that dazzled millions, yet broke countless hearts behind the scenes. And as those who knew him recall, his final wish was simple, that someday Hollywood would become a place where no one had to hide anymore. After years in Hollywood, Audie Murphy understood that fame was its own kind of battlefield, filled not with bullets, but with expectations, manipulation, and the constant threat of exposure. The studio system of the 1950s ruled with an iron hand. Every star was an investment, every image a carefully constructed illusion. Behind every smiling face on a movie poster was a contract that dictated how to live, what to say, even whom to love. Murphy had entered that world as an outsider, a real soldier in a town of make-believe. His honesty often clashed with Hollywood's obsession with appearances. He couldn't understand how people who spent their lives pretending to be someone else were denied the chance to be themselves. The more time he spent among them, the more he saw the quiet tragedies hidden behind perfect smiles. There were actors who loved deeply but secretly, actresses who carried hidden heartbreaks, and countless souls trapped between who they were and who they were told to be. Murphy's natural empathy drew people to him. Many trusted him with confessions they could share with no one else. Perhaps it was his quiet strength, or maybe it was the pain in his eyes that told them he would never judge. He listened to their fears, the fear of being discovered, of losing everything they had built. Some of them confided that they dreamed of leaving Hollywood altogether, of escaping the constant pretense. Murphy never encouraged gossip. Instead, he offered comfort. "You fight your battles the way you have to," he'd say. Coming from a man who had survived real wars, those words meant something. He saw the parallels between the trenches of Europe and the studios of Los Angeles. Both were places where survival demanded discipline and silence. Both could break even the strongest man. But while the battlefield tested courage, Hollywood tested identity. It asked people to become ghosts, versions of themselves sculpted for an audience that demanded perfection, but knew nothing of pain. In quiet moments, Murphy wrote down his thoughts in a journal that few have ever seen. He reflected on the people he'd met, the roles he'd played, and the hidden stories that surrounded him. Those close to him say he wanted to tell the truth someday, not to expose or humiliate, but to show that behind every star was a human being longing to be free. He saw bravery not in those who won awards, but in those who lived with honesty in a world that punished it. As the 1960s arrived, the old Hollywood system began to crack. A new generation of actors demanded creative control, independence, and authenticity. The silent ones who had once hidden in the shadows started finding the courage to live more openly. Murphy, older now, and worn by years of both war and fame, saw this shift as a small victory. He called it the beginning of truth. Yet he also feared that many of his friends would never see that freedom. By the time he reached his final years, Murphy spoke less about his own career and more about what he wished Hollywood could become. In one of his last interviews, he said, "I hope someday this business stops asking people to pretend off-screen." Those words, simple but powerful, were a reflection of everything he had witnessed. The masks, the fear, the loneliness of those who couldn't live as they truly were. Murphy's legacy wasn't just his heroism in war or his roles on film. It was his humanity. He had seen people fight on many fronts, and he knew that not all battles involved guns or enemies. Some were fought quietly in dressing rooms, in lonely mansions, or within the heart. To Audie Murphy, those hidden struggles were every bit as brave as any act of valor on the battlefield. And as he grew closer to the end, he wanted the world to remember that, to see that true courage isn't always visible, but it's always real. By the early 1970s, the world around Audie Murphy had changed, but the ghosts of the past still followed him. The war had left invisible scars, and Hollywood had given him new ones. Though he continued to act, the fame that once seemed so dazzling had lost its glow. Murphy's eyes had seen too much, not just on the battlefield, but behind the studio walls, where ambition often came at the cost of truth. He spoke softly in those years, his voice tinged with fatigue and wisdom. Friends remembered him as a man who carried sorrow like a shadow, but also as someone who never stopped caring about others. He had a rare gift. He could see through the performance. When a fellow actor smiled too wide, Murphy sensed the pain underneath. When a studio boss barked orders, he understood it came from fear, not power. In his final months, Murphy began sharing stories from his early days in Hollywood, recalling moments that few ever heard. He remembered the laughter at evening parties, the forced glamour, and the haunting loneliness that followed when the lights went out. "Hollywood is full of beautiful prisons," he once told a reporter. "Everyone's got gold bars, but nobody's free." He often reflected on the double lives people lived, not out of deceit, but out of survival. Some of his friends, terrified of judgment, lived quiet existences away from the spotlight, finding peace only in private moments. Murphy understood their struggle deeply. To him, courage wasn't just standing before gunfire. It was waking up every day in a world that wouldn't accept who you were and choosing to live anyway. The more he spoke, the more people began to realize that Murphy's legacy wasn't just carved in medals or movie reels. It was written in compassion. He saw the humanity in everyone, regardless of what the world thought of them. He believed that Hollywood had built walls between truth and image, but that someday, those walls would fall. "When that happens," he told a friend, "maybe this town will finally be honest." Those who were close to Murphy said that in the months before his tragic plane crash in 1971, he seemed to sense his time was short. He spent long evenings in reflection, writing letters and journaling about his experiences, not as gossip, but as lessons. He wanted future generations to know the cost of silence and the value of authenticity. He wanted them to see that fame without freedom was just another kind of cage. He also began to speak about the people who had inspired him the most, not the loud or the powerful, but those who carried their truth quietly, refusing to be crushed by shame or fear. He admired their dignity, their restraint, their strength to live honestly, even when the world wasn't ready to understand. To Murphy, those were the real heroes of Hollywood, not the ones on posters, but the ones who survived behind them. His words carried a strange kind of prophecy. Decades later, when the film industry finally began to embrace truth, acceptance, and diversity, many of the struggles Murphy had spoken about came to light. The world began to honor the very courage he had recognized so long ago. Murphy didn't live to see that transformation, but his compassion helped shape it. His quiet advocacy, his belief that no one should ever have to hide who they are, became part of his enduring legend. Even after his death, stories surfaced of his kindness, of the small, unseen ways he helped people who were struggling to live authentically in a cruel industry. He was, in every sense, a man ahead of his time. A soldier who fought one war with bullets and another with empathy. And though the world remembers him for his bravery in combat, those who truly knew him say his greatest act of courage was simply understanding others without judgment. In the days before his final flight in May 1971, Audie Murphy was quiet, almost serene. Those closest to him later said it was as though he had made peace with the world and with himself. He spoke often about honesty, forgiveness, and the strange contradictions of Hollywood, how a place built on dreams could so easily become a nightmare for those who dared to be real. There was a softness in his voice now, a man who had seen both war and fame, and understood that truth was the rarest form of courage. Murphy had always been a man of contradictions, a war hero who hated violence, a movie star who distrusted fame, a public figure who valued privacy, yet beneath all of it was a deep well of empathy. In his final conversations, he talked about the need for compassion in an industry that thrived on judgment. "Everybody's fighting a battle you can't see," he said once. "And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them be themselves." After his death, fragments of his writings and interviews began to surface. They weren't scandalous confessions, they were human reflections. Murphy had written about the people he admired most in Hollywood, not because of their fame, but because of their courage to endure. He believed that the greatest stories were never told on screen, but lived in secret by those who refused to surrender their identity to public opinion. He often described fame as a double-edged sword. "It gives you everything and takes away your soul if you're not careful," he once wrote. And he knew that better than anyone. Murphy had lost friends to the loneliness of the spotlight, men and women who couldn't bear the pressure of being someone they weren't. Those memories haunted him more than the war. He carried them quietly, never naming names, but always urging others to be kinder, to judge less, and to remember that everyone, even the brightest star, can break. In the years following his death, people began to reinterpret his words, realizing that Audie Murphy wasn't just talking about individuals. He was talking about humanity itself. His hidden truths weren't about secrets or scandals. They were about empathy, the simple belief that no one should have to hide who they are to be accepted. It was a message far ahead of its time, whispered in an era when few were ready to listen. Murphy's life remains one of Hollywood's most fascinating contradictions. He had all the makings of a legend: good looks, fame, heroism, yet he sought none of it. What he wanted was understanding. In his own way, he was warning Hollywood, and perhaps the world, that image without integrity was a hollow victory. He believed that a person's truth, no matter how difficult, was sacred. Today, looking back, his words carry even more weight. The industry he once knew has changed. Walls have come down, and the world has begun to celebrate the same authenticity that Murphy defended in his final years. Though he didn't live to see it, his compassion and insight seem almost prophetic. Audie Murphy's story is often told through the lens of war and bravery, but his final legacy is something even deeper. It's about humanity, the courage to understand, to forgive, to accept. He never exposed anyone. He never sought glory. Instead, he tried to lift the curtain just enough to show that even in a city built on illusion, there were people fighting to live their truth quietly, honorably, and with dignity. In the end, Murphy's greatest revelation wasn't about others, it was about himself. He had carried the pain of a generation, witnessed the struggles of countless souls, and still believed in the goodness of people. His life was proof that real heroes don't just win wars. They find compassion in a world that's forgotten what it means to be human, and that perhaps was Audie Murphy's final and truest act of courage.